Hello and welcome to the 5th edition of the RMI Technical Podcast in conjunction with John Osway, brought to you by the Tyre Equipment Parts Association, Motor Industry Workshop Association and the Automotive Remanufacturers Association, all proud associations of the RMI. We're very pleased to welcome Nathan from John Osway. Nathan's going to be talking to us today about torque wrenches. Welcome, Nathan.
Thank you, Hedley. It's actually great being here. So we're going to talk a bit about a torque wrench, and I think I'm going to start off of what a torque wrench actually is. So a torque wrench is basically a measuring tool, and the reason why you would need something like this is you would have to get to some sort of way to actually assess how tight or how loose a nut or bolt would be. And this is exactly what a torque wrench does, is it actually assesses torque for you, and you can actually set it to different types of torques. So you can actually set it up to about 90 newton meters of torque, and that will make you tighten a bolt up to 90 newton meters of torque.
In other words, what you're saying is that a torque wrench would be a micrometer to what a power bar would be a tape measure.
Exactly. I feel the same way about that, because when you got a torque wrench, you're not actually tightening a bolt from point zero to point where you want to get to. You're actually tightening a bolt, and then you put on the torque wrench after you've tightened the bolt to assess what torque strength you need to be at.
How does a torque wrench work? How does it actually measure the finer detail of the torque on a bolt?
So how a torque wrench works is it's got a pretty big spring inside of the torque wrench, and when your spring gets set under a certain tension, according to your scale on your torque wrench, that's actually getting to the perfect newton meter that you want. So basically how it works is once you compress your spring, let's say under 90 newton meters of torque, it will carry on tightening the bolt up to that point of 90 newton meters. Once it gets to 90 newton meters, it'll either click, or if you've got an electronic one, it'll give you a type of beep so that you know where you have to be.
So that's your audible warning that you've actually reached the torque level that you've intended to reach. What makes one torque wrench better than another? Obviously, I assume that it would be down to the internals of it.
I think your biggest thing is your quality of your spring inside your torque wrench. Your ratchet kit is similar to most brands, but the spring itself, how hard and how long it can take that compression. I think the biggest thing on a torque wrench that people aren't using correctly is when they actually physically torque something up to, let's say, 90 newton meters, and they don't put it back to zero when they go and store it. And that's where the quality game comes in, is how long that thing can stay under compression before you have to go and recalibrate it.
So what you're advocating is that a torque wrench should be released to zero after every job, and then reset for the next job on a day, every time there's a need for the use of a torque wrench. Is that correct?
That's 100%. So basically what happens is, like I said, you've got a pretty big spring inside your torque wrench. Under compression, you can give that spring is under compression for, let's say, a week. You basically go back onto zero. That spring's tension isn't going to be as strong as it used to be. So that's basically, like I said, where the quality comes in. And it's still not an ideal thing to do, but I'm saying is if you do it, the quality is going to help you a lot more, so that you don't have to recalibrate your torque wrench every week or month or whatever.
Pretty much like leaving a 1-ton load on the back of a 1-ton bucky for a couple of weeks.
100%.
It's going to destroy the springs.
Yes. Yeah.
Let's just talk about the pitfalls of using a poor quality torque wrench. What is likely to occur if you're using one?
Well, obviously the play from percentage-wise of torque. So let's say once again 90 newton meters of torque, that's what you want to achieve. If your torque wrench is a poor torque wrench, it will probably be set 10% out. And that can be a huge problem, especially when putting on a car wheel or something and you're tightening it up to 90 newton meters of torque. You're actually getting about 85 or above over 95. And that can be a massive mistake, because vibrations on the road and everything can actually cause that nut to fall off, and your wheel can end up falling off.
So in essence, how do we know that a torque wrench is within calibration specs? Is there something we can do in store to check? And if we do decide it's out, what do we do?
Okay, yeah, so obviously the best way is if you have a calibration testing unit, you put it on a calibration machine and you can actually physically see if it's in torque. But the best way, because no one actually has these things in their shops, is if you've got more than one torque wrench in your shop, you can actually compare the two. So you'll set the one at 90 Newton meters of torque and torque a bolt and or nut, and then you take your other torque wrench and set it to 90 as well. If it doesn't click on 90, then you know either or is out. So I presume that you would send both of them in for calibration. And that's quite a nice tip for the guys to use in stores to basically test if it's in calibration.
So Nathan, in most instances, calibrated tools are critically important to how things work. What is the effect of not adhering to correct torque specs?
Well, Hedley, there's actually a couple of things that can happen. So if you over tightening your bolts, you can cause stretch. This will also cause shearing of bolts. So basically what happens is your bolt starts stripping and then it's not tightly in its correct place. And when you under tighten your bolts, obviously you get loose bolts and nuts, and this basically causes reduced clamp load. And once this happens is once you get vibrations and while you're driving, your bolts actually start falling out.
So we could use the adage that over tight is not right and too loose is no good either.
100%.
Okay, so if we go a bit further, what would we do as maintenance with a torque wrench in the workplace?
Well, if you look at job to job, I would definitely say once you've finished working with your torque wrench, adjust it back to 0 again, and then you can start working on your next job again. On a daily basis, always at the end of the day, make sure that once again your scale is down to 0. On a weekly basis, I would make sure that they check the ratchet inside the torque wrench, make sure that everything's still working fine, the ratchet isn't slipping, because a lot of people can confuse the slipping ratchet to a clicking sound as well. So that's a big no-no. And then monthly checkups, I would say that's when you're going to check if it's still in calibration. You can do that little tip where you test your torque wrench against another torque wrench. So yeah, that's generally the maintenance of a torque wrench.
So Nathan, the overall message is really releasing of the torque wrench back to 0 after every job, and most definitely not leaving it under tension overnight. Monthly check that you would do would be to compare a torque wrench against another torque wrench, and if you find that they don't compare accurately, you would then send either one or both for calibration with an official calibration operation.
Exactly, yeah. So I think it's mainly those 2 points, is reducing your scale back down to 0, and then once a month just check if your torque wrench is still set correctly.
For interest sake, do you guys at Jonas Way in South Africa do torque wrench calibration on site, or is it a case where one sends the torque wrench into you to be done?
No, you will have to send it into our service center. So what we basically have is a calibration tool, and it's actually quite big, so you wouldn't be able to do it on site. There is a big difference between Jonas Way calibrations is we actually do it in-house, which is great. We don't send it out to other guys, so time-wise the calibration is quite quickly and it's very accurate. We've got an amazing calibration bench in our service center.
By not sending it out in an outsource, that means that you guys stand by your calibration settings on torque wrenches.
Yes, yeah, we definitely do. We were sent down to Jonas Way in Taiwan, and we did full training on it, and they gave us all the specs of exactly how to calibrate it and exactly what measurements needs to be adhered to. So they'll be about 1% difference from what torque you need to get. So 1% out is actually very accurate.
Okay, the final part that I want to chat about is the training in the use of a torque wrench, because the whole Project Delta and Skills for Profit program that Jonas Way and the RMI are working with obviously talks to a torque wrench, which is an expensive tool, and if it's not used properly because there's no training, becomes an even more expensive tool. How do you guys go about training and educating the use of torque wrench in the workplace?
Well, Hedley, that's a good question, because what I do is I stress the criticalness of why you need to get to that certain amount of torque when you're torquing a bolt or a nut. This comes to the efficiency as well in your workshop. Is without a torque wrench, how do you get to that point of torque? I don't know how else you would measure it, so it's a very, very critical tool to use. And safety wise as well, like a lot of accidents can happen if you don't torque your bolts and nuts correctly. So we stress on training on torque wrenches, and we try and get people to avoid tightening things by just guessing on how tight it is or how loose it needs to be.
So the training that you mentioned, is that done on site in the workplace so that they are educated in how to use it, or is this something that one has to come into Jono's Way to achieve?
No, we actually do it on site with them. We actually do it on their physical jobs that they work with, them on their daily jobs, and then we see the outcome of what's happening in their workshop environment.
What do you find when you start off with a training in a store, current level of understanding of a torque wrench is, and what is the outcome after you've trained them? What sort of result and response do you get from the workers?
Well, once people start understanding what a torque wrench is, or anything really, after we've done training, there's a massive, I would say, happiness afterwards, because the guys actually find their job to become easier afterwards. And you can only imagine, if your job's more efficient, you don't have to work extremely long hours, you get things done quicker and faster, and you get it done the correct way. Yeah, I would just say full happiness.
So yeah, that would talk to pride in the workplace through pride in the work performed by the workers, and they do that through knowledge and education of how to do the job properly.
Exactly, yeah. So I would put it that way. I mean, if you're doing it from 8 to 5, if you don't know how you're doing it, or if you're doing it incorrectly and you know you're doing it incorrectly, it's not going to be a fun environment for you, or a proud environment for you. So the training outcome is always great.
Thanks, Nathan. So to wrap up, if we look at skills for profit and quality of product, the important aspect is to buy a decent quality product like a Jono's Way torque wrench, maintain it, have your staff trained, and maintain the development of pride through skills for profit. And we say pride in the workplace and pride in the workers. And the training is free of charge, I assume, and and available all over
the
country.
Yes.
Great. Well, Nathan, thanks very much for joining us today, and we wish you well in further training and development, teaching people about talking.
Hedley, thank you so much for you as well. We appreciate everything.
Pleasure indeed. So with that, we come to the end of this week's podcast. Thank you for listening, and we hope you'll join us next time. And please stay safe.